The moment you see the truth, there is no going back. I said this once, long before I understood what it really meant. My name is Ethan Cole, and in this city, I am not just a man with power, I am the structure that holds power together. Every decision I make has weight, every silence I keep has consequences, and every person who crosses my path becomes part of a game they do not even know they are playing. That night began like any other controlled operation in my world, silent, calculated, precise. A shipment dispute near the eastern docks had drawn my attention, nothing unusual, nothing I had not handled 100 times before. But then I saw her. Emily Carter. Not someone I knew, not someone who should have been there, just a white girl standing at the edge of a situation that did not belong to her world. She was not dressed like she belonged in danger, and yet danger had already found her. I did not move at first. That is not weakness, it is strategy. In my position, every reaction is measured, every pause is intentional. I watched as the situation unfolded around her, noticing how she did not scream, how she did not run immediately, how confusion fought with instinct in her expression. That was the first anomaly. People in my world usually understand fear instantly. She did not. Or perhaps she simply refused to accept it. One of my men signaled for direction, but I did not respond. Instead, I studied her presence in that space like a variable that should not exist. The shipment issue could wait. Everything could wait. Because something about her disrupted the structure I had built in my mind for years, and I do not tolerate unpredictability unless I understand it completely. When the situation finally de-escalated, I expected her to leave like everyone else who accidentally steps into my world. But she did not leave correctly. She hesitated, looked back once, then twice, as if she felt something watching her even when she could not see it. That was when I made my decision, not out of emotion, but out of necessity. I needed to know who she was, why she was there, and why my instincts refused to ignore her. I instructed no one to approach her directly. Instead, I chose distance, observation, silence. Because in my world, silence reveals more than confrontation ever could. As she walked away from the docks, disappearing into the city lights, I realized something I had not allowed myself to consider in a very long time. This was not about business anymore. This was about disruption. And I do not allow disruption to remain unknown for long. The city never really slept. It only pretended to, breathing under neon lights and quiet lies. And I remember the exact moment I understood that nothing in my life would ever be simple again. Ethan Moretti had a way of entering a room without raising his voice, without demanding attention. Yet somehow every detail around him adjusted like the world itself was listening. And I, Lily Carter, stood at the edge of that world pretending I did not feel it shift under my feet. I had been told not to ask questions, not to look too long, and especially not to mistake silence for safety. But silence was the only language he ever seemed to trust. That evening, the air in his private office felt heavier than usual, not because of anything visible, but because of everything unsaid, as if every object in the room had been placed there to measure honesty instead of decorate space. He watched me the way someone studies weather before a storm, calm but unreadable, and I kept my hands steady even though I could feel my own thoughts betraying me. I had come there under circumstances I still did not fully understand, only that my name had been spoken in rooms I was never invited into, and now I was standing in one of them, expected to remain unchanged. Ethan did not offer comfort, he never did, but he offered presence, and somehow that felt more dangerous because presence meant awareness, and awareness meant being seen completely. He asked me a question that did not sound important on the surface, something simple about choices and timing. Yet I knew better than to believe anything about him was simple. I answered carefully, choosing words like stepping stones across water I could not see the bottom of, and for a moment there was only the sound of the city outside the window, distant and indifferent. Then he leaned back slightly, as if deciding something about me that I was not allowed to hear, and I felt the invisible weight of evaluation settle between us. I wanted to ask what this was, why I was there, why my life had suddenly become a subject of quiet attention from someone like him. But I also understood instinctively that asking might break something I could not repair. Instead, I held his gaze longer than I should have, and in that silence I noticed something unexpected, not threat, not warmth, but restraint, as if he was constantly choosing what not to become. When he finally spoke again, his words were measured, almost careful, and he told me that trust was not something given quickly in his world. It was observed, tested, and sometimes never fully granted at all. I did not know yet that I was already being tested, not in dramatic gestures or obvious demands, but in the quiet way I responded to uncertainty, the way I stood my ground when I should have stepped back, the way I refused to look away when most people would have. And as I left that room later, walking through corridors that felt too long and too quiet, I realized something unsettling had begun, not a confrontation, not a confession, but a slow entanglement that neither of us had fully agreed to, yet neither of us seemed able to stop. That night stayed with me in a way I could not explain, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because nothing had, and yet everything inside me felt permanently shifted, like a door had quietly closed behind me without my permission. I kept replaying the last moment in Ethan Moretti's office, the way he had looked at me as if I were not simply present, but being measured against something I could not see. And I wondered how long someone could stand under that kind of attention before they started becoming different without realizing it. The next morning, I tried to return to normal life, to the familiar rhythm of ordinary obligations, but normal suddenly felt fragile, like a thin layer of glass over something deeper and far less predictable. My phone had fewer messages than usual, yet each notification felt heavier, as if silence itself had learned how to communicate pressure. I told myself I was overthinking, that people like him did not truly cross into the lives of people like me without reason. But even as I said it, I knew reason was not the only force operating in this situation. Later that day, I was called back, not directly by him, but through channels that made everything feel more deliberate, more structured, as if even distance was being controlled. When I arrived, the building felt the same, but my perception of it did not. Every hallway now carrying the memory of what I had felt before, every corner suggesting something unfinished. I did not see Ethan immediately, and that absence was its own kind of message, one that made me more aware of my own thoughts than I was comfortable with. When he finally appeared, it was without announcement, as if he had always been part of the space, and I was simply catching up to reality. He did not ask how I was, and I did not expect him to, because people like him did not operate in questions that had no strategic value. Yet there was something in his pause before speaking that felt almost intentional, like he was observing whether I had changed since the last time. He told me very little, only what was necessary, but his words carried an undercurrent that suggested I was no longer just an observer in his environment. I felt a quiet tension build between what I wanted to know and what I was being allowed to know, and I began to understand that uncertainty was not a gap in information, but a tool in itself. As the conversation ended, he gave me no clear direction, only a suggestion of presence, as if my continued proximity to his world was not optional, but already in motion. Walking away again, I realized the most unsettling part was not fear or confusion, but recognition, the sense that whatever boundary I thought existed between us was not being crossed suddenly, but carefully erased over time, and I could no longer tell whether I was being pulled in or choosing to stay. The days after that began to blur in a way I did not notice at first, not because anything dramatic changed on the surface, but because my awareness of everything around me had become sharper, almost uncomfortable, as if I had stepped into a room where the lighting revealed details I was never meant to see. I continued my routines, answering messages, attending to obligations, speaking to people who had no idea that part of my attention was no longer fully available to them, because a portion of it remained fixed on something I could not define clearly. Ethan Moretti did not appear constantly, and that inconsistency itself became part of the pattern, because his absence never felt random, only deliberate, as if even silence had structure in his world. When I did see him again, it was not in the same setting as before, but in a place that felt more public, yet paradoxically more controlled, where every movement seemed observed without effort. He acknowledged me with a brief look, nothing more, yet that briefness carried weight that I could not ignore, and I found myself adjusting my posture instinctively, as if presence alone required a certain form of awareness. There was a conversation that followed, though it was not a conversation in the way I understood it in ordinary life, more like an exchange of measured observations disguised as simple words. He asked about details that seemed unrelated on the surface, But I had learned by then that nothing he asked was ever without purpose, and I answered carefully, noticing how even honesty could be shaped depending on how it was delivered. At one point, there was a pause that lasted longer than expected, and in that pause I became aware of something subtle, not pressure, not threat, but calibration, as if he was adjusting an internal understanding of me in real time. I realized then that whatever test I thought I had already passed or failed was not fixed, but ongoing, evolving with each interaction. Later, when I was alone again, I tried to reconstruct the moment logically, to assign normal explanations to everything I had felt, but logic kept slipping away from certainty, leaving only patterns that did not fully resolve. I began to understand that the real shift was not in what he said or did, but in how I now experienced silence, how absence itself had become something active, something that carried intent. Even ordinary environments no longer felt entirely neutral, because I could not fully separate them from the memory of his presence. And in that slow realization, I understood something I was not prepared to admit, that distance was no longer a barrier between our lives, but a variable that was being quietly rewritten without my consent, and I was already positioned somewhere inside that change whether I accepted it or not. The moment I started to believe I understood the pattern of my life, everything shifted again in a way that made me question whether patterns were ever real or simply something I created to feel in control. Ethan Moretti did not increase his presence. He did not suddenly change his behavior, and yet I felt him everywhere, not as a person physically nearby, but as a fixed point in my awareness that everything else seemed to orbit around. I noticed I began anticipating things I had no logical reason to anticipate, like subtle changes in timing, unexpected silence between messages, or the way certain places felt different even before I entered them. It was not fear in the traditional sense, but something quieter and more persistent, like standing too long in a room where the air pressure slowly changes without anyone acknowledging it. When I was called again, the circumstances were different enough to feel like coincidence on the surface, but too aligned with previous moments to feel accidental underneath. I arrived with more awareness than before, and that awareness itself felt like part of the test, as if noticing too much or too little both carried consequences I did not fully understand. Ethan was already there when I arrived this time, not in a way that suggested urgency, but in a way that suggested certainty, as if time had arranged itself around his schedule rather than the other way around. He did not acknowledge my arrival immediately, which I had learned was never disregard, but rather timing, as if even attention followed rules I had not been taught. When he finally spoke, it was not about anything directly emotional or personal, but about choices again, about consistency, about how people reveal themselves not through declarations, but through repetition under pressure. I responded carefully, aware that every answer I gave was being placed somewhere, not just heard and forgotten. There was a moment when I almost asked what I was supposed to be proving, but I stopped myself, because I realized that asking might assume there was a single answer, and I was no longer certain of that. Instead, I observed him more than I spoke, noticing how little effort he used to create control without ever explicitly demanding it. And in that observation, something uncomfortable became clear to me, not that I was trapped, and not that I was free, but that the space between those two ideas was being shaped in real time by interactions I could not fully interpret. When I left, I did not feel a conclusion, only continuation, as if every step forward was not leading away from something, but deeper into a structure I had only just begun to recognize. There was a point in the following days when I stopped trying to label what was happening and began instead to simply observe it, because every attempt at definition seemed to collapse under its own assumptions. Life continued in its ordinary shape on the surface, but beneath it, I had become aware of a second layer, one that did not announce itself, but consistently influenced how I experienced everything else. Ethan Moretti remained unchanged in his outward behavior, which in its own way was the most unsettling part, because it forced me to accept that whatever shift was occurring was not coming from obvious action, but from sustained presence and selective attention. I began to notice how often I adjusted myself before speaking, how frequently I considered outcomes that had nothing to do with immediate situations, and how quickly uncertainty had become something I was no longer trying to eliminate, but trying to navigate. When I was called again, the process felt less like an event and more like a continuation of something already in motion, as if each meeting was not separate, but part of a single unfolding sequence that I had only recently become aware of. Ethan's demeanor during this encounter was calm in a way that made interpretation difficult, because calmness from him did not signal resolution, only control over variability. He did not increase pressure, he did not introduce new demands, and yet I felt more exposed than before, not because anything about me had been revealed, but because I had begun to recognize how much could be observed without being stated. There was a brief exchange where I realized that my answers were no longer just responses, but data points being placed into a larger understanding that I was not yet able to see in full. That realization changed how I spoke, not into silence, but into precision, as if every word carried weight beyond its immediate meaning. At one moment, I almost questioned whether I was participating voluntarily or simply following a path that had been structured through repeated proximity, but the question itself felt incomplete, as if it assumed boundaries that no longer applied. When the meeting ended, there was no clear conclusion, no signal that anything had shifted externally, and yet internally I felt a distinct change, not in circumstance, but in comprehension. I understood then that the most significant transformation was not in what was happening between us, but in how I was beginning to interpret reality itself through the lens of that connection, and that interpretation was no longer something I could easily step outside of. There is a strange clarity that begins to form after enough repetition, not because the situation becomes simpler, but because my mind slowly stops resisting what it cannot immediately categorize. I started noticing that my understanding of Ethan Moretti was no longer built from direct interactions alone, but from accumulated impressions, small moments that did not seem important individually, yet together created a pattern I could not ignore. He remained consistent in ways that did not invite emotional interpretation, and that consistency forced me to rely more on observation than assumption. I found myself paying attention not only to what he said, but to what he chose not to say, and in that space of omission, meaning began to form in ways I was not used to interpreting. When I was brought into contact with him, again, the environment felt familiar, yet my perception of it had changed enough that familiar no longer meant safe or predictable. There was no escalation, no sudden shift in tone or behavior, and yet I felt a stronger sense of awareness than before, as if proximity itself had become more informative over time. At one point during our exchange, I realized I was no longer trying to anticipate him in a reactive sense, but instead trying to understand the logic behind his restraint, which felt like an entirely different form of engagement. That shift was subtle but significant, because it meant I was no longer focused on avoiding uncertainty, but on interpreting it. He spoke less than I expected in that moment, but each sentence felt positioned with intention, as if silence and speech were both being used with equal precision. I began to understand that nothing in these interactions was random, yet nothing was explicitly explained either, and that balance between clarity and ambiguity was becoming the defining structure of my experience. When the interaction ended, I did not feel relief or tension, only continuation, as if I had temporarily stepped out of one phase of understanding and into another without any clear boundary marking the transition. Later, alone again, I tried to recall how I had thought before all of this began, but the attempt felt distant, almost theoretical, as if I were studying a version of myself that no longer fully matched my present awareness. And in that realization, I understood something I had been avoiding acknowledging. Whatever this connection was, it was no longer something happening to me from the outside, but something I was actively learning to exist within, and that learning had already changed the way I would interpret everything that came after. There is a point where understanding stops feeling like discovery and starts feeling like adaptation, and I realized I had crossed that point without noticing exactly when it happened. My interactions with Ethan Moretti had become less about surprise and more about recognition, as if I was no longer entering unknown situations, but re-entering variations of a structure I was beginning to internalize. Nothing about him had changed in any obvious way, yet everything about how I perceived him had shifted, and that shift made me question whether change had ever been external at all. When I was called again, I did not experience hesitation in the way I once did, but something more subdued, a form of awareness that had replaced reaction. The environment, the timing, even the silence between words, all felt like components of a system that functioned consistently even when I could not see its full design. Ethan's presence in the room remained controlled and measured, but I no longer interpreted that control as something directed outward toward me in a simple way. Instead, I began to see it as a broader way of operating, something that structured interaction itself rather than any single exchange. During our conversation, I found myself listening differently, not searching for hidden meaning in individual sentences, but trying to understand the relationship between what was emphasized and what was deliberately left unsaid. That way of listening changed how I responded, because I stopped treating each question as isolated and began treating them as part of a continuous evaluation that extended beyond the moment. At one point, there was a pause that would have previously made me uncomfortable, but instead I recognized it as part of the rhythm I was learning to adapt to, and that recognition itself felt like a turning point. I began to understand that what I had once perceived as uncertainty was actually consistency operating at a level I had not been trained to interpret. When the meeting ended, there was no resolution, no shift in tone that signaled completion, only a continuation of the same underlying pattern that now extended beyond the room itself. Walking away, I no longer felt like I was moving out of his influence, but rather that I had begun to carry a version of it with me, not as control, but as awareness that no longer turned off when the interaction ended. And in that quiet realization, I understood that whatever this had been from the beginning, it was no longer defined by moments of contact, but by the way those moments had permanently altered how I would process everything that followed.